it is typical of the people I write about and gotten to know well, is they will look at the very big picture and see how all the pieces relate and not get hung up at looking at details. And it's really, I think, is a major part of our educational system. It's very much focused on getting the details and remembering the details. And it's almost forbidden to go out of your subject matter and go into somebody else's subject matter, even though it seems to be related, that you're supposed to stay within your guardrails. You know, this is very typical of the academic world. A lot of these people I write about are jumping out into the bigger picture and seeing the relationships with things that were not obviously connected before.
Hello, welcome to Square Peg's podcast.
In this podcast, we share first-hand experiences of neurodiverse graduate students and faculty members.
I'm your sometimes guest host, Lexi Hain.
And I'm the host, Arik Zagi. You just heard from Thomas G. West, distinguished author and advocate who joined us for this episode. Tom is known for his insightful exploration into the minds of creating visual thinkers, gifted dyslexics, and the impact of visual technologies on society. His groundbreaking work, In the Mind's Eye, first published in 1991 and recently released in a third edition in 2020, delves into the unique strengths of individuals with dyslexia and has been translated into several languages. This book was awarded a gold seal by the research librarians of the American Library Association, highlighting it as one of the best in its category for the year. West's contribution extends beyond this seminal work. His second book, Thinking Like Einstein, and his third book, Seeing What Others Cannot See, further investigates the advantages of visual thinking and the ways technology is reshaping education and work. He has been invited to share his insights with scientific, medical, art, design, computer, and business groups across the US and 19 other countries. His presentations at prestigious institutions and organizations, including Harvard and MIT, underscores the global relevance of his research. Let me tell you, this topic hits close to home. As someone who has struggled with dyslexia all my life, I'm looking forward to having this conversation with Tom. Let's dive in. Thank you very much, Tom, for agreeing to join me today. I'm really excited about this conversation, and I'm here because, again, I'm a dyslexic person myself. I struggled through the traditional education system for years, and also I'm doing research that is related to dyslexia, and I've interacted with a lot of other dyslexic kids, adults in PhD program, in engineers. And so this is near and dear to my heart. And I really want to take this opportunity to spend our time so I can gain more insight into that. And I'm sure there is a lot for our listeners to enjoy learning from you. So I'm curious to know what triggered your interest in this field, when and where that started. So let's go with some background.
Well, it started really with our kids. Our two sons started having difficulties in the earliest grades. They're both rather brilliant in their ways, but they had difficulty with early schooling. And then they got tested, and then I got myself tested. And then I went to a dyslexia conference and began to learn about these things. And it was like the revelation. I come from a family of artists and engineers going way back, very visual people. And I couldn't learn to read when I was in the primary school mostly for the first 3 or 4 years of primary school until I began to learn to read. And then I was always reading more slowly than everybody else. But then gradually I realized I was reading more deeply than others. And all of this is a very strange combination of talents and difficulties, which is very characteristic of many dyslexics. And to jump over that, eventually I started doing research and decided to write something about this. The field is full of paradoxes. I couldn't learn to read, but I think I became a very good writer. And part of it is because I tell stories in simple language.
Isn't that
and
amazing?
avoid
Because I've heard
pro-
many dyslexic, we have big name dyslexic authors actually and
Oh,
writers.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that is
Well,
confusing to a
this is
lot
a
of people.
recognized pattern. This our brain is sort of designed for storing stories, as well as visual material and things of that kind, which I'll talk more about later. But the preamble, though, is that I wrote a paper, and that started getting interest in people in this community of psychologists and parents who are interested in gifted learning disabled children and so forth. And then I began to realize there was something really important there. And here I'm at Washington, D.C., where I have all the Library of Congress and the Library of Medicine all at hand. So it's very easy to dig around and see what I could find, especially with these famous people like Michael Faraday, James Clerk Maxwell, Albert Einstein, and other folks. Winston Churchill, General George Patton, Henri Poincaré, all kinds of folks in the sciences and politics and so forth. And you just dig around, but you have to look for the primary sources. You have to look at the letters and diaries and information from their sisters or whatever. You don't trust the biographers. They don't understand what's going on. They don't understand this stuff at all because it doesn't seem to fit, or they don't know what to look for. But then it became this first book, and the first book, In the Mind's Eye, came out in 1991, long time ago. But right away, I gave some talks at the National Library of Medicine for the people who had visualized medical data. And that book was, the librarian got upset. Had never had such a long list of people wanting to see this new book because it was dyslexia and talent together. And these people, it's their life story. And that's really the main thing, is that all kinds of different organizations invited me to give talks. One of the first was the Max Planck Institute. All 50 of them would get together once a year to talk about computers. This was, again, a while ago. And I had written a short article in a physics magazine about the return to visual thinking. Modern scientists are doing too much mathematics and don't think in pictures like Einstein did. And they don't understand things, or Tesla, if you like. But they returned to visual thinking. They said, "Oh, we're having a conference on this very issue. Will you come and speak to us?" And I thought it was one institute, but they said, no, it's all 50 of us, all kinds of different subgroups of different sciences. It's been just amazing that this book has found its own way around the world, and it really struck a nerve with many people, and especially with engineers. I should emphasize that. I work with companies where I'm surrounded by engineers because I was part of these government contracts where it would be jobbed out to lots of engineers, but they needed somebody who could write, write the proposals and write the reports and repair the presentations. And I did 2 trade missions, one as a participant and one as a leader of a bunch of engineers talking about renewable energy in the Pacific Rim, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth. So that's always been this strange combination of somebody who's very comfortable in engineering, but I would never be an engineer because I would never be able to pass the exams. Nor, frankly, I'm not interested in it. It's the ideas behind it and how the different aspects of the mathematics and engineering and visual thinking relate to each other is most of interest to me and where I feel comfortable.
So
that's a long answer.
Sorry. No, that's good. That's great, actually. For our audience to have a better idea what you mean exactly by visual thinking, do you have like a working definition for that? Can you unpack it a little bit? What you mean by that?
Yeah,
because that's a pretty forgotten concept in a lot of fields, actually.
There are various things. Well, first of all, my parents were traditionally trained artists, so they painted pictures sort of like the French Impressionists. They were trained in the early 30s at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, which was the first art school in America. So actually just to think in pictures and to have that talent is one thing. But then to be able to imagine the behavior of a mechanical thing and be able to build a little model in your head and to run it in your head and see if something happens, how does it behave. I was linked to people at Caltech where this fellow, Bill Dreyer, he was dyslexic. He could imagine how the molecules fit together for the human immune system and came up with some ideas about how the human immune system works that was extreme novelty. Most of the people he talked to about his new theory, he gave talks for 12 years. I got to know him quite well. I would visit him often. He gave these talks for 12 years, and they were not popular because he was talking about all the professionals didn't understand what he was talking about because he was so visual. And then somebody else proved that he was right and got a Nobel Prize. But it's really being able to experience the world and model it in your head in the way some people are trying to do with, of course, with computer graphics and so forth.
So
that's the way I look at it.
If I can add, like, again, my first-hand personal experience to that, the word, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you want to add to that, the word visual thinking, it may not tell the whole story. I mean, when we talk about like visual thinking, a lot of people may think about that I can imagine a shape in my head rotated, like kind of like things that we can.
Yeah.
So that I think that like visual thinking skills of dyslexics goes beyond that. I think it is like more of like having a mental map of the world or the concept that you're working. So essentially that mapping of like abstract concepts into this model, although it may not be visual, it may not be kind of something that we can associate to shapes and forms, but operating with the understanding of that map. For example, I sometimes use the example of like puzzle. I mean, I actually had that experience working with my daughter not long time ago, making some complex puzzles, and she was complaining that you jump around too much. Focus on this area, we are focusing on this. And that was a very interesting moment for me because I realized I want to work on this puzzle globally while she is patiently working on like different parts of it. My interest was more on like forming a better understanding of the global picture of it. So is that something that you've noticed?
This is perfect. It fits exactly. Another phrase that I use is big picture thinking. And how, well, your first observation, one could think about a mechanical structure in your head, but you also can use that as a kind of metaphor for all kinds of things in the world, politics, religion, all kinds of things. And also, the business of your puzzle is perfect because it is typical of the people I write about and gotten to know well, is they will look at the very big picture and see how all the pieces relate and not get hung up at looking at details. And it's really, I think, is a major part of our educational system. It's very much focused on getting the details and remembering the details. And it's almost forbidden to go out of your subject matter and go into somebody else's subject matter, even though it seems to be related, that you're supposed to stay within your guardrails. You know, this is very typical of the academic world. A lot of these people I write about are jumping out into the bigger picture and seeing the relationships with things that were not obviously connected before. Almost everybody I write about is they're mavericks, and they're not popular in their groups because they're talking about stuff that other people don't understand. One of the famous things was somebody said, if so-and-so is a mathematician and he knows physics, or he knows physics and he's thought to be a mathematician, we don't want to know these people because they're not staying within the boundaries. And of course, the people I write about are making their discoveries and because they right away go across the boundaries.
Yeah. And with the emphasis that we have on cross-disciplinary research, and people are coming to the realization that we cannot work in silos. I mean, that time is over.
Yes.
And now we have to
Yes.
start finding patterns, cross-disciplinary, bringing computer science to another fields, bringing neuroscience to other fields. And we make sure that there is cross-pollination, and that is actually where the future discoveries in science and engineering, I mean, will happen. I am a true believer.
Yes.
I mean, like quantum computing, if you think about this, it brings like the most fundamental mathematically driven like rules of physics to something that engineers can use. And so this is not within the constraints of one discipline anymore. And we have to start appreciating that. Maybe this is a good time for me to kind of like ask you what went wrong. I mean, in our education system, you just pointed that out briefly, that we don't appreciate that type of thinking. Again, like I have a lot of ideas on what happened like 50, 60 years, more than 60 years ago, maybe we were thinking about this new educational model. What do you think is the source of confusion in the education system?
Well, I think what's useful to me, and should be useful to everybody, I think, is just look at the history of how these things develop. I looked at a couple of 100 years. I find this very useful because you can see how it turns out.
Yes.
And who does which things. And actually, one of the people I started with, Albert Einstein, I just knew that he was extremely brilliant person, but had trouble in school, and I didn't know what it was. And then I realized his mind was so visual and so creative and so forth. But then he led me to James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, and I sort of knew a little bit about it. But then if you read the primary sources, it's just amazing how visual these people are, like peas in a pod. And over time, the way lots of people who are thought to be brilliant scientists, then it turns out they're not that brilliant. They just got stuck in an old idea. Whereas those three people, they endure and just get better and better. And also their respect for each other. For example, Faraday was a blacksmith's son with virtually no education, but he learned everything by his work in the laboratory, but also his imagination and coming up with ideas that were really powerful. And when Maxwell did his famous formulas, he said, these are not my ideas. These are Faraday's ideas put into mathematical form. And then you have other people like Lord Kelvin. People know chemistry. They know so many degrees Kelvin and all that sort of stuff. And you read the history of Kelvin, and he was certainly brilliant. They thought he was more brilliant than Newton in his day. He thought he was a genius. But in fact, on certain things, he was extremely dumb. And there was a famous lecture given by Langley at the Royal Institution in London about the possibility of manned flight without a balloon, with heavier air. And Langley was talking about this. And Kelvin got up out of his seat and strode to the podium and said, Langley is talking nonsense. I can prove mathematically that it's impossible for man to ever fly in a heavier than air airplane. Mm-hmm. And only 3 years later, 2 bicycle mechanics proved Kelvin wrong. I just love these stories.
I mean, we are all humans.
But this is an example of somebody can be so brilliant, especially as a mathematician of the 19th century, and he was a good engineer, but he lacked the imagination, and he was just so proud of his accomplishments, and it blinded him to things that should not have been. I mean, this is another thing. Helen Taylor talks about how dyslexics can discover new things, but you also want to have working in a team with somebody else who's not dyslexic to cover the basis for things that they're not good at.
And that's a very important point, because a lot of conversations I've seen about that, like advantages or strengths of neurodiversity, different dimensions of neurodiversity. There is a tendency to portray these individuals as superhumans, and I think that's not the right approach.
No.
It's just like they have a different way of understanding, interacting with the world, processing information. And at the end of the day, it's not that we want everyone to think like dyslexic people. It's that like segmenting out one of these modes of cognitive like processing is not good for scientific progress. So the point is that when we talk neurodiversity, we mean it. We mean that at the end of the day, these individuals, my daughter, for example, like when we were working on that puzzle, that was a very, very fruitful collaboration, because I was like, again, like trying to fix some areas of the puzzle that it formed an idea where things are. And she tirelessly worked on the local regions of that, and that is what we want to see more and more in science. But unfortunately, our education system is promoting one way of learning and information processing and presentation. So going back to the question of like what went wrong in the education, if you look at the education of today, the like K-12 education, what are the basic flaws you see as an outsider, the way things are being done?
Well, I have to see this from the point of view of my own life experience, because I just don't read a lot of the educational literature, but it's always in the back of my mind. The main thing is that I feel is that we've focused more and more on a kind of memory and reading and arithmetic kind of stuff, because the people who design the tests that's the way to do it. But I guess I'm old enough too that when I grew up, I was growing up in a rural area of Maryland, and I was surrounded by farmers' sons, and we had shop and we built things and we had mechanical stuff, because this was very literally important to these farmers' sons, and they're going to be farmers dealing with equipment. But also, I could see the connection between just doing all this visual stuff. And when I was in college, I also did lost wax bronze casting with my professor, which is an ancient task. And there are lots of ways of doing it wrong, and you get bronze heads with holes in the back of the head or something like that. And I saw these in Athens. I saw holes in the back of the head, and the scholarly write-up did made no reference to it. And I said, oh, I know exactly why that hole happened and what they did wrong, because I had this hands-on knowledge. But the hands-on knowledge at shop and so forth, professors of education were not interested in hands-on. That was low-level, not sophisticated stuff. But being able to do hands-on things is very valuable, because it educates that visual spatial part of your mind and gives areas of success to certain groups as well. So I think that's terribly important. And of course, one of the main themes that I dealt with early on in doing my research, I went to the computer graphics conference and got to know computer graphics people. And there are many, many dyslexics. They always said that maybe half the people in this conference are dyslexic. But it's really people who were dealing with computer graphics, whether it was astronomy or feature films or whatever. This is a high visual group, and this need for educating that part of the mind is terribly important, and to have an area of success for people who are not sort of just words and numbers.
How do you think we can accomplish this in the current educational model?
Oh, you change the tests and you change the incentives, and you say, well, this is an area that we need to understand. And another thing is, we're right at the beginning of this enormous wave that was long expected with computer artificial intelligence. I started talking about this, my first book, it's now like 30 years talking about it, but mostly we knew this was coming, but now it's right on top of us. Some people are arguing that ChatGPT are doing things that the A students got good grades in doing. But now ChatGPT can do the same job, but faster and more cheaply. So the things that the professors like to see are less important. And the things that dyslexics are good at, would become more important. It really turns the whole thing upside down. Most people don't understand this. But occasionally you'll see pockets of people who say this is one of the big changes.
Yeah.
This memorization is not so important anymore because it's so easy to do with these machines.
Yeah.
So this is a major change. So, but to go back to your question is you need to have more balanced in the people who design courses and design tests. Oh, one other thing is Apple Computer, Johnny Ive was the main designer working with Steve Jobs, and they loved these simple designs and so forth. Well, Johnny Ive's father was working in education in England or Britain, and he wanted to bring back to the schools what we used to call shop for visual education. And Johnny Ive is known to be dyslexic, but a spectacular designer that had these wonderful inventions.
The GPT that you mentioned, it definitely resonates with me. I'm a big advocate for the use of AI, and I think there is so much focus on the negative aspects of it, like bias, like this being not accurate, some of the responses it generates. I think we have to get past that, and like we have to work hard to make sure those issues are addressed, but that should not be the reason for us to discourage people to fully implement this new tool in education. To me, it is some people, they compare it with calculator or things like that, even like internet or computers. For me, this is as transformative as fire.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
It's a very big deal.
Yeah, so it can really kind of change things. And it's interesting. I really liked what you mentioned, that a lot of those skills that the current education system is emphasizing will be obsolete skills. And maybe that explains some of the pushback we are getting from the education, like that they don't like this.
Because these are the people who have been successful. They've got the top grades, they went to the top schools, and they got top jobs. But the computer is challenging the things that got them there. And you want more Einsteins and Faradays and Maxwells. No, and fewer Kelvins, if you want to put it that way. Because it really is very powerful indeed. And again, I'd love to go to history. And if you just look at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when you have all these weavers were weaving, had workshops and cottages and stuff, weaving cloth. And then you had this machine that came along to do this more rapidly and more cheaply and so forth. And you put the weavers out of business, and then you have the Luddites who came in and wanted to destroy the machines, and so that the weavers could get their jobs back. And the laws first were, they'd say, well, you've just destroyed property. Then they said, no, the owners are allowed to shoot people. And then there was a capital offense. People got hanged or sent to Australia for life. Wow. And I said, oh my goodness, are we going to have to repeat all this in the time of AI? It shows you what can happen, and you have a kind of possibility for some aspects of a repeating cycle as these things become more and more angry, more and more frightening. And there are many benefits, but then anytime you can have a report written in seconds that would normally take a human being a couple of weeks to research and write, that's such a big multiple.
Yeah.
So we have to confront all these things because it's on our doorstep.
With open mind, for sure. And that another point that we have to really think about when we talk about AI, there are multiple AI platforms, large language models, but this is at its infancy. So we have GPT-4.
Yes.
Think about iPhone 4 when it was out. This is the same iPhone. You can call, you can take picture, but like the picture we take with like iPhone 14, it's a whole different class and like level.
Oh no, I'm
So,
very conscious of this.
so this thing is gonna just get better. And again, like there are some people that they say at some point we're gonna run out of like training data on the internet. I think there are other ways to make this kind of like these systems smarter. And I personally use that a lot. It has really helped with my anxiety going through the day, honestly. Like I have ADHD also, and like
Yeah,
quite
it
frequently.
usually goes together.
Yeah, it goes together. Quite frequently, I was just like, I had to send an email. It was not like the most kind of stimulating topic. I had to kind of like talk to a person like our administration about some budget stuff, and like just dragging my feet along and like kicking the can down the road and day after day. And at some point, I mean, to a point that it caused trouble. Nowadays, and the reason was that like I was waiting for that moment of clarity that I can write a good like paragraph, clear, crisp. And nowadays I can just
slight panic.
Yeah. Nowadays, I just type it in. I mean, so these are the points I want to kind of talk about, and I generate something, and I read through it. I change a few things, I move a few things around, I add something, remove something, and send it out. I mean, like 20 minutes, and that used to become a major kind of snowball effect for me. And I haven't been able to generate like good ideas yet. I've tried to push it multiple times and it is not there yet. But I'm sure like GPT-6, 7, they will be able to do very well in idea generation also.
Well, that's sorts of interest, because then you get into the business. What is real creativity? And this is the thing that I think I see among the dyslexics that I know. And of course, Helen Taylor speaks of the search for new ideas and new patterns and stuff like that. And this is terribly important with the scientists I work with. And I should make a point of saying that in many cases, these people came to me. They said, I don't like to read books, they'd say, but I read your book and it speaks to me and I want to tell you my story. Come and visit me next time you're in LA. Mm-hmm. And this has happened over and over again, this kind of thing where the people who are really doing the high-level creative work in the sciences especially, but also in mathematics, like Benoit Mandelbrot, that they have a lot of resistance among their compatriots. But your business about getting a first draft is I think, very useful, because it lays out the stuff that is known and frees you from a certain amount of drudgery. But then you want to be able to sit back and see how these things fit together in maybe unusual ways, and going and actually my mind flips to Jack Horner, the dinosaur researcher, who said he was teaching his non-dyslexics to think like a dyslexic, because he wanted to make sure that his students, he had 19 graduate students, that they would stop citing references of what they read and go out to the field and walk among where the dinosaurs' fossils are and see the patterns in nature. Mm-hmm. And he says these dyslexics didn't have trouble thinking out of the box because they were never in the box. Mm-hmm. And I think that whole idea, particularly somebody who is dyslexic and with some ADD, there's a lot of potential there in the way your brain is set up, and you like to have the machine deal with some of the humdrum stuff, but also give yourself permission to just look at things and play around with them in your mind and observe. Or another parallel I think of is in psychology and education. When I was in college, B.F. Skinner was popular, and you'd have these Skinner boxes, and you'd put the animal in a box and see how they're going to behave under certain circumstances. And then you had the other people who were they would go out to the African areas and look at and live among the animals and describe the animal behavior. The first is you have a controlled experiment and you do all kinds of numbers about it. And the other one is you just look at what the animals are doing and why and how, why is this behavior and what is the consequences for the group of animals and what sort of reproduction and over time and how do they deal with what they eat and on and on and on. And I said, well, I justify what I'm doing is I'm like the person who goes out and just watches the animals and how they behave. So I'm watching the dyslexics and the ADD people and others and seeing what is their life story? How do they find success and what their ideas were so original and so unpopular in the beginning, but they were so important. Or another one is Maxwell. I didn't make reference to his. There's a scientist named J. Willard Gibbs in the United States, and he was dealing with chemistry, and he had this idea of visualizing information on a surface plot, like is that you wanted to plot information in 3 dimensions. And Maxwell thought this was a great idea. and he made out of clay over several weeks in the winter a clay model of the behavior of water. It's so much ice and energy and so forth. And he cast it into plaster of Paris. And it's like a little model. It's only a few inches square, but it's a surface plot where it's like a mountain and valleys and little hills and so forth. And of course, where every point shows a behavior of this complex relationship. And there was a professor who came to me named Joels, and he said, I'm doing this with a computer now, but all this stuff is very unpopular because everybody memorizes a certain set of formulae. The behavior of water. But if you have mixed water with ethylene, for example, you can't predict the behavior with the old formulas. But you can predict the behavior with the visualization. And he was doing his computer model was doing the same thing that Maxwell was doing. And I thought that's another example of how a technology can really be transformed, that you'd see a little bit of this in an early person like Maxwell, but most of the chemical engineers learned the formulas, and that's where they stopped. But Maxwell went way beyond that. And there are many, many factors where he was way out ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, when we start translating nature to formulas and like papers and scientific discoveries, sometimes we forget that like there is a nature out there still. Like
yeah.
So this mathematics
you
essentially represents
observe the nature.
Yeah. So going back to nature is like very important, or at least valuing the work of people who go back to nature and they want to, rather than spending time in libraries in front of computers, they want to spend time in nature and just like tinker with things, like break things, fix things. I mean, again, like it may from outside appear as a very unproductive approach, but there is something in that is critical for the advancement of science and discoveries. I think we cannot say, oh, computers are now advanced enough to do simulation, or we know a lot more advanced math than maybe 1990 or 2000, so we can just rely on like machine learning or like computation power and completely separate ourselves from nature. I think something will be lost there, and that is going to actually slow down our scientific progress. That is my belief. This is something, when you were talking, actually, this is for the first time I thought about this, that like GPT actually has permitted me to be more dyslexic. So
yeah, and that's good.
That's great, actually.
Especially about, I just love Jack's. I visited him twice, and his digs in northern Montana, so I got a sense of him and how. But he really that whole business about.
Can you describe his visual thinking in work?
Nature.
Describe his visual thinking in work, like when you go there. When he's like exploring, excavating, what is that you think, okay, this his mind definitely works differently? what comes to your attention?
Well, it's not so strange when you think about it. As a matter of fact, this is something he talked about. He said, the discoveries I made were so obvious, were so very obvious. But he would look at, you're dealing with the layout on the land, and you could see that there was a nesting area, and that I think the little dinosaurs would grow quickly, and they had to be fed by the parents to grow that quickly. And then he wanted to break an egg and go and see what. Lots of different organizations had eggs, but they wouldn't allow him to break them. And he said, how can you want to look at what's inside the egg?
Yeah.
So he found his own eggs, and he said, so he says, I had a hammer and I smashed the egg and looked inside, and there was the fetus of the dinosaur. And he said, it's just like a bird.
Yeah.
It even looks like a bird in that stage. We had a long conversation about why people thought these eggs were so precious, but they didn't want to break open and look inside. Or another example, which is just mind-boggling. One of his students, her name is Mary Schweitzer. I've written about her. She's a professor, but she's dyslexic. She was teaching at somewhere in the South, and they had found a femur from a Tyrannosaurus rex in a very remote area of northern Montana. And there was this cliff, and it was in the cliff with these bones. They pulled out these bones. It was a Tyrannosaurus rex. And of course, they had to take all the earth over the top of it. It took a lot of work. What they do is when they get the bones, they put it with plaster of Paris around it to protect it until it gets to a place where you can work on it. They said that this plaster of Paris was too heavy, so they had to break it in half. And they sent one half of it to Mary in her university in the South. I think Vanderbilt it is, but I'm not sure. And they kept the other. And they didn't treat the bone. They usually treat it with chemicals to keep it decomposing too quickly. And she looked inside, and the first thing she saw was a deposit of calcium inside the bone. Now, she had been trained in biology, and other people in the field, most other people were trained in geology, not biology. And she said, oh, this is like a deposit you see in bird bones where you store up the calcium so that it's enough calcium to make the eggshells. So she knew that this Tyrannosaurus rex was a pregnant female. But this is like 60 million years ago. But then she looked farther inside, and she saw little flexible fibers, and she realized that they were the remnants of blood vessels, and inside of them were remnants of red blood cells. She said she couldn't sleep for weeks because she thought if she published this, it would be so ridiculed and unpopular and criticized. She did this, and then other people, they did criticize her vehemently. They said nothing like that could ever survive for 60 million years. But then other people looked inside the bones they had, and they found the same stuff. And they said, Mary Schweitzer is correct. So she invented the new field of paleontology and molecular biology because all the books in the world would have said it was not possible to have anything that survived so long. And she proved it. It did. And I think, going back to the original site, these bones were in a cliff so that all the rays from the sun and so forth were this gigantic lump of earth above it to protect the molecules, I guess, from destruction. So all these things together. But it was really a great example of a true innovation and true observation of what was available in the field. Many scientists would not have realized what was going on because they didn't have the biology background. And see, there's a good example of jumping from one field to the other and being able to see things that would not be recognized by the specialist.
Yeah.
And there must be many other examples.
There are so many of these inspiring stories. So I want to know your take on this dilemma, that there is enough now documented showing the success of this cross-disciplinary work, radical thinking, visual thinking, like mental experiments, the importance of them in scientific breakthroughs. But when we talk to maybe a fourth grade teacher, their response is, yeah, these are cool stories, but I have to make sure my kids learn how to read and write because I don't want to put them at disadvantage. So they keep, again, sending kids to special education, special session, like emphasizing, okay, like you have to really drill this kind of spelling thing into your brain. There is a point that like there is a kind of like disconnect between this communication, like as we speak, I mean, it's very
let me
obvious.
respond to this. I think the answer is obvious. You need to have curriculum and the test designed to be able to pick up the two kinds of things. You want to have some basic understanding of the reading and the processing and the spelling and things like that, but something that respects the visual, spatial, creative side, and that's challenging, but respecting the abilities of this other group and seeing how the two groups can fit together. There are various educational things where they are doing these things here and there, but it's not dominant.
Yeah.
So you have the dominant educational curriculum for many teachers is so language based and so
Yes.
and when they talk about mathematics, they're talking about mostly arithmetic. And when I was in college, I was required to take the 2-semester course in mathematics, all of mathematics. It was a survey course, yes, but the focus is what you can do with different kinds of mathematics. So I learned about Boolean algebra and things like that, but also combinatorics and set theories.
Wow.
And the professor said, I want you to make up your own cheat sheets with the formulas. I don't want to test whether you can remember the formulas. So we had our own sheets. We took them into the exam. But he said, I want you to prove to me that you understand what you can do with this mathematics. And I don't want you to do it flawlessly or fast, but I want you to understand what it's for and what you can do with it. That just appealed to me. It's sort of like mathematics, the deep philosophy of mathematics, which was a strong point for me.
We have long forgotten that. I mean, it hasn't happened recently, but I used to go to like conferences or smaller like size workshops and like share some ideas with some other people, some of them like higher up. And the immediate reaction most of the time was, oh, that looks promising. Why don't you draft like a 5-page summary of like what you want to do? And that was essentially like, okay, you're not going to see me again. So it was immediately like the reaction was like, show it in the form of writing rather than, okay, let's have a follow-up conversation on this or sketch up something. It was always the reaction is like, can you show me how it translates into like 5 pages of plain English? I mean, like, so, and I suspect, again, like I had to survive it, I had to persist, but I suspect it's going to be discouraging for a lot of dyslexic learners. I think they have a crisis in academia, honestly, generally. All the practices of like evaluating merit, hiring, even like promotion, raise, and all of those things, they heavily depend on your writing skills. And not creative writing, not storytelling, like how,
no, I
just
understand.
can you write like a reporter, you know, so... And it's bad for science. I mean, we wrote this article with Helen and Sarah.
Yes, I read it.
So it's bad for science. I mean, this is a bad practice.
Well, I guess I'm on two sides of this. Not everything needs to be verbalized. One thing is that the whole business of reading is not so required anymore because machines can read to you almost anything as long as you understand the language, can see how that fits into your ideas. But I would just go back to, if you can work with somebody, whether it's AI or a colleague who is a better writer than you are, they can help you work together. And it's back to Helen Taylor's idea again, is people working together in teams. And I think I've already made reference to it. I realized that in my various jobs that I did, I was often surrounded by engineers, but it was my job to integrate the stuff and to prepare reports for the government officials that we were working for and so forth, and really to ordinary folks in presentations. But I thought that was my role, was to, strangely, that even though I couldn't learn to read early on, I was one of those dyslexics who became quite used to writing. And then I did the proposals and I did the reports and did the integration for the presentations. So find somebody else.
Yeah, that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing.
Writer.
Yeah, with GPT, definitely things changed a lot. But like before that, I was always working with very capable people to help me to put my ideas in writing. Yeah,
right.
For sure. So one may listen to this, what you said about actually you ended up becoming a good writer, and say, okay, so if we really continue pushing these kids to practice writing and like we separate them and work with them independently, we will get there. Do you agree with that?
Well, I feel as though there should be a restoration of balance.
Mm-hmm.
It should be more mechanical thinking, more, or like in mathematics, like the basic that I studied was why doing this math stuff, not whether I memorized the right formulas. In my third book, Seeing What Other People Do Not See, I deal with stories from people with Asperger's. And I think really the main final idea is that so many of us have areas of great strength and sometimes conspicuous weaknesses, and we have to work together in groups that with mutual respect. And you have to have a curriculum that also has tests and courses that are also designed. I think there's inclination for high verbal folks to disrespect visual, spatial, manual abilities. Whereas you see, if you look at the great scientists, for example, they're dealing with stuff that's visual. I haven't even mentioned this one family with 4 Nobel Prizes where they did X-ray crystallography. I got to know the woman who was the daughter of the man who was the boss for Watson and Crick when they discovered the structure of DNA. Well, that's a visual thing, 3D model. How does it work? How does it carry information from generation to generation? That's a wonderful example. The whole thing of X-ray crystallography and being able to understand what the X-ray crystallography was in the beginning. The French scientists and the German scientists didn't understand, and it was these English scientists, Bragg Thompsons, that made the discovery. So you had this one family with plenty of dyslexics, plenty of visual thinkers, and on the wall of their dining room, they had 4 Nobel Prize medals.
Wow.
4. 2 from the husband's family and 2 from the wife's family. And I got to know these people quite well and stayed at their home. So it was just so obvious that all these things were linked together.
What would be your response to someone who is listening to this and say, oh, we already are stretched thin in our schools. We don't have resources to add those other modalities. And like, what would be your response to that? That they use the excuse of resources?
Well, first of all, you need to have people who are trained to do this and a balance of talents of some kind. And then your allocation of resources is going to come.
Yeah.
They're going to allocate resources now based on the tests that exist. But if you change the tests, you change the things that are needed. One of the early talks I gave was to the people who did the College Board, the Educational Testing Service. And I gave this talk years and years ago. And the people afterwards said, oh, I think you're right about this stuff. He said, but we can't meddle with the SAT because that's our cash cow. That's where we make all our money. So we want everybody to use this test.
Interesting.
And I said, well, you could redesign part of the test to cover these things. But they knew that they were doing a one-sided operation and felt as they were forced to do it. But the game has changed. The fastest, most brilliant test taker in the room is now a robot.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
So you're thinking about these other possibilities and look mostly at these early scientists to see how they came to their discoveries.
This is actually great. I'm really happy we are having this conversation because this is very insightful. With your wisdom, looking back and like putting that in historical context and telling what's going on.
History is
It's very important. One other concern that I have is with this powerful AI tools and with the kind of lopsided approach of education that is essentially training kids for jobs that they will be performed flawlessly and much cheaper by AI. Where are we going? Where do you think we're going to land? I mean, like, if we don't go back and really kind of rethink about some basic fundamentals, I mean, like, at least in the short term, I'm talking about like 10, 15 years.
It's going to be more and more apparent to everybody that AI is fast and cheap for a certain kind of thinking. But that will bring forth the other kind of thinking and the value of the other kind of thinking that AI can't do quite well. And I guess there are two examples that I haven't, there are so many examples, but one is the GCHQ is the place that was the descendant of the code breakers at Bletchley Park during World War II.
Yeah.
And it's all well known, Turing and all that.
Yeah, Turing.
But they became aware that their dyslexics and other different thinkers, Asperger's as well, were people who really thought differently and could see patterns in world events and things that were terribly important. And they used the example, it's really counter to you, but they said our dyslexic people most people don't see the whole story until all the different jigsaw pieces are on the table. But he said, our dyslexic could look at just two pieces and see the whole pattern and understand the problem and what to do about it. That's their quotation. So our dyslexics were our secret weapon in the terrorist organization. And so that was revealing. But the other thing is that you do have this thing in the business world. There are well-documented reports now that people in the business world realize that if you want to hire somebody, you want to hire a dyslexic because they'll come up with new ideas for new innovations, for new products that people will want, that kind of thing. And the A students aren't going to necessarily come up with the new ideas that are yet. And there are lots of entrepreneurs that were dyslexic, and this is all well documented. So the world of business consultants has a lot of information on how dyslexic people contribute to the wealth of the companies.
Yeah.
Surely the business world will look at this early and the educators will look at this last.
Yeah. But again, like, unfortunately, some of the hiring practices are following, what the education meritocracy essentially is focusing on, which is like GPA or number of public. I mean, nowadays, most of the focus on when we hire new faculty members is not like what has been your radical contribution, is more like how many papers you have published, So,
absolutely.
So that definitely, and like that example of code breakers, it's just, I mean, because Nazi Germany was winning that war with U-boats and all of those things. So that without their contribution, I mean, we could have been living in a world that is governed by Nazi Germany, essentially. So they can play a critical role.
There's no doubt about it. And it's now there are a number of films and books, of course. But I'll just make this the final thing, is that I happen to know somebody. There were several groups in Britain that really loved my stuff, so they organized many talks. And one of the people I met was the person who lived right in the village next to GCHQ. And first of all, she dealt with the dyslexic kids of people who worked there. And then they said, but the adults have certain problems as well. I wonder if you'd come in and talk to these people. And pretty soon she had dealt with all kinds of organizational problems and people, various difficulties. And they also used my books in GCHQ. And then the dyslexics inside the building, this is all high security, like our National Security Agency. So they said, well, we should have a diversity talk and we should invite Tom West to give a talk. So I gave the first Diversity Day talk to GCHQ some years ago, first ever. And then all other people who were Asperger's and dyspraxics, the dyspraxics, but we use different terminology in America, but these were people who could easily learn 10 or 15 different languages.
Wow.
But if you took them on a long walk, they would be exhausted. They didn't have it was just, there were these unusual setups. They seemed in most ways normal. But they're these extremes of talent. So it was really quite fascinating to be part of that organization and to see what they talked about. I've written about it in different places, but always referring to public resources. Not
So
anything
for some listeners that they may not know about dyspraxia, can you tell us what that is?
Well, that's what I've just described. It's the people who this is the terminology they use, is they were extremely talented with many languages. It was just extraordinary. But then they had other kinds of difficulties. And one was that they would be physically exhausted if they did much physical stuff.
Yeah, with the coordination, they say like there are some challenges with coordination. I mean,
Yeah.
like again, that is something that we can find in the literature.
Yeah.
So thank you. I can't believe it's been already more than 1 hour that we are talking. I learned so much, and I'm sure that our
good.
our listeners
the books are there, and some of my lectures are still on YouTube.
We will definitely include some useful links that direct our listeners to the right resources. Thank you so much, Tom, for agreeing to do this. Thank you for listening to Square Pegs. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Our podcast aims to raise awareness around neurodiversity, advocating for inclusive educational methods, and enhancing belonging for all students. We would love to hear your feedback. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share your biggest takeaways from this episode. Your reviews and feedback helps us improve. You can also leave us a message at squarepegspodcast.com, and we might feature it on the show. Thank you for being a part of the Square Pegs community.